then I'll just invite Noel forward, and we'll put the recommendation. All those in favour, please say against. Oh, we did it.
No, that was the moving.
I think we've just
that
passed
was
it.
the order of
I
precedence.
think we've just passed it, Madam Chair. Should we have a cup of
I'm
tea?
happy to move the recommendation, Madam Chair.
You're happy
I
to
just don't
move
want to be
that?
stuck like we were last week without anything to discuss.
Happy to move. Councillor Cooper, seconded. There's a seconder. I'm happy to move for the sake of discussion. And we'll, Noel, we're in your hands.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This item addresses a request from the Heritage Advisory Panel to consider the matter of council placing a heritage order over the Hannah block. It wasn't a request from the Heritage Advisory Panel to impose a heritage order, it was just to consider a heritage order. I think you've heard already that the Hannah block has undoubted heritage values. The critical issue here is that it's not scheduled in either the operative plan nor is it scheduled in the unitary plan. As a result, in 2014, Council granted consent to demolish the Hannah block. Notwithstanding that the block is not scheduled, consent was required as a small 1 square metre approximate corner of the Hannah block was in the extent of place of the chapel, which is a scheduled building on the site. It's important to note that consent, the trigger for consent wasn't because of the values of the Hannah block, but to ensure that the values of the nearby building, the chapel, would not be adversely affected. However, the application was a discretionary application, and under that the council could consider part 2, and under that it could have considered the values of the Hannah block. Summation of all that was that the King's School has a legitimately sought and processed and obtained consent to demolish. The heritage order overrides that consent, but there are consequences if the council goes down that route. The first is that the council could be subject to judicial review. Imposing a heritage order would expose the council to accusation of being inconsistent in its decision making. And if that was found, the likely outcome would be that a judicial review would overturn any heritage order, and we would revert to the current status. If a judicial review was not sought, and that's in the hands of the King's School, and we proceeded through the heritage order process, the council is exposed to the risk of costs and compensation. And unfortunately that is impossible to quantify. Suffice to say, it would be significant. And the reason why I say that is that this council in the last 5 years has issued 2 heritage orders. And I think it's illustrative of the nature of a heritage order, just to quickly touch on both of those. The first one was 95 Queen Street, the Ranchod building. That building was deemed at risk, or because it was not scheduled. There was no consent to demolish. The council issued a heritage order. It bought the council sufficient time to assess the values, go through the proper process, and now it is scheduled through the unitary plan. Very minimal cost through that process. The second example is the Thomas Dew building in Hobson Street, diagonally opposite the police station, where there was consent to demolish and the council imposed a heritage order. That was 5 years ago. That process is still going on. The outcome, the settlement of that was through a negotiated process, which is still confidential. What I can say to you is that there were significant legal costs, but there were also costs to settle that issue which were significant. One of the issues that has come up two of the issues that have come up in the presentations was, has the council received any nomination on this building? And the answer to that is, according to our records, no. No officer recalls anything about this building, but there's certainly no records of anyone nominating this either through Auckland City or this council. The second issue was facadism, and I would agree entirely with what Mr. Madsen had to say around the option of facadism here. It's not an ideal heritage outcome. You may remember with the Thomas Dew building, that settlement was criticised for facadism, and that retained a lot more of that building than is proposed here. I think if the council had reached that decision through the original consent, that might have been okay, but we would have still been accused of facadism. To achieve that through the heritage order process, we will be accused of facadism and we will have paid for it. So given all those risks, Madam Chair, particularly I don't think it'll get through the first hurdle of a judicial review. I can't recommend that council imposes a heritage order over this. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Noel. Right, we'll take questions and then we'll move to the debate. So questions first. Councillor Watson and Councillor Cooper. Question?
Yeah, I just wonder if you could clear up this issue of the assertion that the initial assessment was inaccurate. You mentioned the 30-metre radius, and there was just a 1 metre imposition there. What about the comment that there was no heritage links with the chapel when we had Mr. Patterson as the same architect, and you know, the suggestion that would have made a significant difference to the assessment carried out by the council?
So there's a couple of points to make there. The Salmon Reed Heritage Assessment and the Salmon Reed Heritage Impact Assessment were available at the time of the consent. And that's put the council at a difficult position because it's arguable that it could have declined that consent based on that information, but it chose not to. In terms of the relationship between the Hannah block and the chapel, the difficulty lies in the objectives and policies in the operative plan, which require an assessment of the impact on the chapel, not on the impact on the Hannah block.
Yes.
So the other point is that the Hannah block is not within the extent of place in the unitary plan, because through that process the officers have been grilled extensively around the extent of place for all the buildings to ensure that this issue doesn't come up again. If a building is to be within the extent of place of another building, it needs to be done appropriately and accurately, rather than what appears to be in this instance a matter of a 30-metre circle.
I guess you know, this goes to the notion that the mistake has been made, and that mistake in turn is justification for then the heritage order and a re-examination. So as a lead in to trying to get a better outcome, what's your view on the advisability of that, given that there does seem to be some ground here that gives the council an in?
So I think the important thing is that the council made the decision originally based on the same information then that it has now. I think Mr. Thomas said there's a lot of red herrings in all this, and that's correct. And there are red herrings on all sides of this. The council had the ability to, through a discretionary activity, to say no in 2014. It chose not to. It had the information it needed. It didn't. For it now, 12 months later, to make a different decision would subject it to, in our advice, a successful judicial review process.
Okay. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. Can I just follow on? Councillor Watson said a mistake had been made. Can you just clarify? I didn't hear anything. You said that there was a mistake made.
No,
I just want clarification, because that's really quite misleading.
I don't think there's been a mistake made. I think what has happened is the officers have interpreted the original consent process one way, and so did the Independent Hearings Commissioner. And there is a possibility of another interpretation.
Yeah, of course. So, Madam Chair, I mean, that's the case with every decision. That's not particular to this. This is just what the RMA is. It's a matter of judgment of experts in the field, independent commissioners. I just had one question for you, Noel. It was this presentation by one of the presenters saying that the Becker summary report recommended to the school retaining the facade of the Hannah block because it's a more affordable option than a new building. There's been a lot of discussion around costs, but they don't lie with council, they're private spend. So under the RMA, is there any obligation to a commissioner to consider affordability in a demolition consent or even a resource consent?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, thank you. So that's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Casey.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've got two questions, and they're both about bodies that are not present today. And the first is the Heritage Panel itself.
Yes.
They are our advisory panel. They have obviously, there's only one paragraph here that relates to them in one resolution. Can I, through the chair, perhaps ask the chair of the Heritage Panel to tell me what the reasons were behind the resolution?
The resolution of the Heritage Advisory Panel. The Heritage Advisory Panel was appraised of the situation a couple of months ago by friends of the Hannah Block, who are ex-students of King's School, and given the obvious heritage value supported by the Salmon Reed support, that the building has significant heritage value, the Heritage Advisory Panel advised, which is its role, the council to consider a heritage protection order being actioned in this case. Just slightly disagree with Mr. Reardon. The Heritage Advisory Panel can't order these things, and that is why it has asked the council to consider this, and that is appropriate advice from the Heritage Advisory Panel.
Thanks, Mike. My second question is another group of people who are not here today, and that's the King's Board of Trustees. In particular, a comment made by UNO with regard to the trustees, and it's in paragraph 12, and it says, in discussions with the King's School Board of Trustees, they advised officers that the reason for demolition is that the building requires considerable and expensive earthquake strengthening, and even then the building would not meet their teaching requirements. So that there's nobody here. Can you speak a bit more to that? Because that's a fairly strong statement in light of what we've heard today from the opposers.
So just as background, after the Heritage Advisory Panel passed its recommendation, the chair asked me to meet with the School Board of Trustees to see if there was a way forward. I met with them. They advised me of their reasons, so that statement is their statement. And they also advised that they were intent on proceeding with their consent. So I think one of the things, it's about this red herrings issue. There are issues on one side of the argument and there are issues on the other side of the argument. And all the council can do is process the consent that it has before it. And that's what it did.
So is the point that you're making there, Noel, we can't then instruct the school on how they will, if there's not a heritage order, we then have no rights over what decisions the school may or may not want to make as far as their design?
That's correct.
Okay. Councillor Cashmore, question?
Very briefly, Madam Chair. No, the school chapel, which there's been quite a bit made of, is a listed heritage building.
Yes.
And I believe that close to that is it a block called the Tower Block?
That's correct.
Is that similarly listed as a heritage area?
My initial response is no, it's not, but it is within the extent of place that was
Close to the
agreed.
chapel.
Yeah, that was agreed through the unitary plan process.
Right. So there's quite different architecture and different styles between the Hannah Block and the Tower Block and the chapel, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
There's probably 30 or 40 years and differences.
That's correct.
Eventually more.
Yep.
Thank you.
And there's a new building coming out from the Hannah Block now that was built in the mid-70s, I presume? It's different again.
1969.
69, there you go. So we have different heritage and different ages around the area in the vicinity.
Yes. I think the point is that on many of these larger, older schools, there will be a number of buildings that will have heritage values that will not be recognised in the unitary plan.
Thank you, Noel.
Any other questions? Councillor Darby and Councillor Burrow.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, I'm perplexed by this one. Beautiful building. I was at the school just recently for something, and but I just want to check, has the construction tender been let for the project?
I can't answer that. The advice I received from King's School when I met with them is that they were ready to go yesterday.
Okay, that would assume
That would
they've
assume
let
that
the
contracts have
contract.
been let, yes.
Okay, and the application was considered over a year ago, and it was a non-notified, and it was decided almost exactly 1 year ago. Maybe, Noel, this is maybe more a legal response. How would the High Court view the council delaying 12 months to issue an NOR?
Yep.
I'm not a lawyer, but I think I would provide the same advice that most of the councillors around here would know. That's a long time to wait. There's been a lot happened in that time. The consent has been partially activated with the removal of the clock from the tower. They advised that, the King's School advised that they have had architectural drawings drawn up, contracts let. So there has been a significant time between the original consent and now.